Caitlin, I think we'll address this first one to you. Question, I tested for SCN a few years back and didn't find any. Do I really not have any SCN in my fields?
Well, it's always suggested to test for soybean cyst nematode every 3 to 5 years at the very least, especially if you're growing soybeans continually. If you're growing every year, I would test a little bit more often. But just because you have a 0 count does not mean you don't necessarily have soybean cyst nematode. And I kind of depicted that with that picture of the soil probe going in, catching those couple cysts in one picture, and then on the right-hand side of the picture, you didn't necessarily catch those 7 cysts. So it's important that just because you got a 0 count doesn't mean you don't have soybean cyst nematode. So that's why it's important to test every couple of years.
All right, very good. Les, how much of a problem is SCN on your farm there in northeast Missouri?
As Caitlin suggested, really in northeast Missouri, everyone has cyst. It's just going to depend on the severity, and it's going to depend on where you sample in the field. You can literally just be a few feet away, and your samples might come in. So that's why it's a benefit for as a grower, a soybean grower, it's a benefit to use seed treatment, really, and almost everything we sell has seed treatment on it. So it's truly a benefit as a soybean grower to not go out with a naked soybean. Make sure it's treated, and make sure you got an Olivo type product to control against soybean cyst, as well as protect yourself against SDS on those bad years.
So let's staying with you. Do you see SDS and SCN as a pest on your acres?
Yes, I mean if you control it, you won't see it as bad. And Olivos help solve that problem where you don't see the visual signs as much from the top side, unless you do root digs. But for the most part, Olivos remedy that, but without Olivo, you're going to have problems every year. And that's where we're getting our advantage in yield right now, is by having the seed treatment products that we need to go ahead and carry us through. And we are seeing some SDS in areas this year, but what I'm finding, most of it is not really where we've had the Olivo product. It's just been on areas where people just use fungicide and insecticide. And it hasn't been severe, but central Missouri this year has got a pretty good outbreak of SDS.
All right, Caitlin, just a heads up, I've got a question coming to you in just a moment, but let me remind folks again to use the question mark icon if you have a question. Your question will then be answered by email. Another question, again, Caitlin, this one for you. In what type of year do SCN cause the most problems? And we're looking at this from maybe from a weather standpoint.
Soybean cyst nematode tends to reproduce a little bit more in drier years. And this is especially true in sandier soils, so soils that may have a little bit higher sand content. So that's not always the case, but drier years we see a lot more soybean cyst nematode reproduction. So that would be like 2018, there was a lot higher reproduction.
So staying with that weather theme, Caitlin, occasionally the question is, we receive a lot of rain. My fields are really soggy. Will that drown out the SCN in my field?
That was a question I did get a lot last year with all of the flooding we had early in the season. Are my soybean cyst nematodes going to drown in my field because it's underwater for X number of months? And that is just not the case. What happens is soybean cyst nematode, like every other nematode, actually absorbs oxygen through its skin, and that is actually from the water that is in the ground. And so it will not drown soybean cyst nematode in the soil. So just because your field is underwater or there's a lot of moisture does not mean soybean cyst nematode will go away.
All right. Troy, I hope you didn't think that we forgot about you, because we do have a question or two for you as well. One is, why is Olivo outperforming several of the competitors shown?
I think that's a good question, Dave. Olivo, I guess number one, in terms of some of the data that I showed, Olivo is hard chemistry. It has activity on all stages of the soybean cyst nematode, as demonstrated by some of those slides and some of the research that's out there. So whether it's the juvenile stage, it'll reduce mobility and limit mobility extensively in the soil. It actually will cause mortality of all stages. So it does a very good job in the soil around the base of that root where it was at in the soil. And it's very targeted for that portion. I think the other thing that we need to think about in terms of performance, we'll see in the field, it's not like soybean cyst nematode causes sudden death syndrome or sudden death syndrome causes soybean cyst nematode, but we find on a lot of the acres out there that both of those pests kind of coexist. And Caitlin and Les maybe could speak to this as well, but from across a broad spectrum, we would say that at least 80% both of those pests exist on 80% of the acres. Maybe more in Missouri and surrounding geographies. It might even be higher. It might be approaching 100% of those acres. So having a product like Olivo that has activity on both of those pests really helps provide a very good return on investment for the growers out there that utilize it as a seed treatment.
Well, Troy, you did hit on something because one of the questions that we had in, and again, maybe Les and Caitlin both want to chime in on this, but the question, I have seen SDS in my fields, but I really haven't seen any SCN. How often are they in the same field?
Well, I'll answer that. Soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome in places like Missouri, where both pests and pathogens have been established for quite a while, it's pretty common to see them both together in a field. In areas, there are areas of soybean production where they're not as common together, and that's the areas where you kind of move farther north. But a lot of the established soybean growing areas in kind of this central U.S., soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome are pretty commonly occurring together in most fields. And oftentimes when soybean cyst nematode pressure is higher, you're going to see a lot higher levels of sudden death syndrome foliar symptoms. You're not always going to see really high levels of sudden death syndrome root rot, but you can see a lot of those foliar symptoms exacerbated.
Les, anything to add?
No, in Missouri, I would say you're 100% here, like Caitlin was talking about, and Troy talked about a little bit. We have, a tremendous amount of soybean cyst nematodes here in Missouri, and I would say you're probably not going to find SDS without cyst under it. Just the fields I've been in, and it's kind of a no-brainer though, really, for a grower. For the additional cost, if you're buying fungicide and insecticide anyway, why not spend the extra bushel or bushel and a half, depending on where what rate you want to go. But we typically use the full rate is what I like to use instead of the half rate. And, it's really not that much more of a cost for your return on investment. You're going to make money every time.
Well, this is a question for me. I didn't ask the question icon, but my question is this something that you can see either when you're out walking in your field or driving down the road, or is this something that you're going to have to get out and dig?
So,
or either one?
I was actually going to say there's a little bit of a caveat to soybean cyst nematode as compared to sudden death syndrome. So a lot of people talk about sudden death syndrome more often because you can see the problem. When you're driving down the road, you can see it light up in a field. Whereas soybean cyst nematode, it's kind of that hidden killer. It's underneath the ground. You can't see it on the roots. You have to get out into the field and you have to scout until the populations are high enough levels where you can start to see those stunted plants, that yellowing of the root of the leaves. You're not going to see the yield loss symptoms when it's green and it's flush like every other field. And so you really have to get out and you have to dig up roots and you have to look for those white females during the season.
I was going to mention, Dave, is SDS, you can actually see it from the pickup window with going by fields if you know what to look for. So this time, you know, it's the crops are progressing far enough along now. It's not as obvious, but 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was pretty obvious driving down the road. You could tell which fields were seeing SDS or, you know, SDS pockets out there, and which ones weren't, and pretty obvious from the pickup truck window anyway.
Yeah,
Troy?
yeah, absolutely. Just to back up Caitlin, I would certainly encourage growers to go out and dig up soybean plants. We've been encouraging growers to go out and dig up corn plants for years to look at what's going on below ground. We need to do the same thing with soybeans. We need to get out there, dig up those plants, inspect the roots. Do we have some diseases on the roots? Can we find soybean cyst nematode cyst on the roots? Take a look at those. We showed you some pictures of what the cysts look like here today on the webinar. Those cysts are about 1/10 of the size of what a soybean nodule would be, but you can see them with the visible eye, although they are small. Just get out, dig up your soybean plants and see what's going on below ground as well. You can suffer up to almost 30% yield loss from soybean cyst nematode, depending on the conditions that you have out there, right? If you've got a lush growing season, plenty of rainfall, plenty of nutrients, those plants can look pretty good above ground and still have quite a bit of damage going on below ground. Yeah. Good question.
All right. Well, again, if you have a question, go to the question mark icon at the right of the screen, submit your question, and then it will be answered via email. Caitlin, another question. When should I sample my fields for SCN, and how do I interpret samples that I collected in the fall versus spring?
So the best time to sample for soybean cyst nematode is in the fall following harvest. That really is the best indicator of your soybean cyst nematode population and what happened in the season. If you can't get into the field in the fall because there's just too much rain or something is just, if there's too much going on in the fall, the next best time would be in the spring prior to planting. As far as interpretation of your egg counts, it depends upon what lab you send to as to what your count numbers will come back as. But the general counts that I look at, if you're looking at egg counts of higher than 4,000 eggs per 100 cc, you have a high SCN population, and that's in Missouri. So some states, the counts are going to be a little bit different. If you're looking at egg counts between 1,000 and 4,000 eggs per 100 cc, that's going to be a moderate range. And if you're looking at egg counts below 1,000 eggs per 100 cc, then that's a low range. So that's, like I said, for the state of Missouri, that's what I kind of look at as the low, moderate, and high ranges. And so each of those ranges will really dictate the magnitude of management you want to take. If you're looking at high egg counts, you really want to take a very aggressive approach to management versus if you're looking at the low counts, your current management plan is probably pretty effective, but you want to stay on the same track.
All right, very good. Les, another question in for you. What is your return on investment from Olivo?
Well, that's a great question, Dave. The return on investment, again, I would only go out with a full rate, which is 1.18 ounces per unit. And that's a Olivo product on a unit of soybeans. So it doesn't take a lot of product, but that's going to, for the most part, that's going to control the cyst and also going to help us through the SDS season. So again, I've seen tests where we've ran where just at the full rate, we've seen 11 and 12 bushel consistently, where we've got pretty heavy cyst pressure and where there's a little bit of SDS coming in. So if you've got a heavy rate of SDS coming in, it could be much more than that. But I think consistently, even if you don't see cyst pressure and you don't see SDS, I think you're going to get 4 to 5 bushel every year, side by side. So I think it's that much of an advantage.
All right, very good. We have almost run out of time here. Again, let me remind those that have submitted questions that answers will be submitted via email, so kind of be watching your email inbox for that. Troy, Caitlin, Les, anything that you'd like to add before we pull the plug here in the webinar?
I just want to say that really management starts with taking a soybean cyst nematode test in the first place. So if you haven't taken an SCN test recently, I really encourage everybody to get out into the field and take that SCN test this fall. It's really a good time to take it, get that egg count, and start the management plan from there. If you want more information on SCN or the SCN Coalition, which is a public-private partnership that we have going on also to kind of really talk about soybean cyst nematode and management, you can go to the SCNcoalition.com. BASF is a partner in that, along with a lot of the universities that we have.
Dave, I'd say from a grower perspective, if you're having your beans treated, make sure whoever you're purchasing your seed from, and if you haven't tried Olivo in the past, give it a try. Split fields or so forth, and compare it to regular fungicide, insecticide, or some people just use fungicide. So give it a shot, but you need to do it over a 2 or 3 year period. It shouldn't be just based on a 1 year period. So I think it'll make them money every day.
Troy, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just like to add, just like Caitlin said, there's a lot of great management information out there. Soybean Cyst Nematode Coalition, the SCNcoalition.com website has a lot of great information. Locally, if you have questions, contact your trusted agronomic advisor or your BASF local representation. You can also find more information about our products at agproducts.basf.com. So thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity, Dave.
Well, let me thank once again Caitlin Bessonette, Assistant Extension Professor and Director SCN Diagnostics in the Division of Plant Sciences at the University of Missouri, Troy Bauer, BASF Seed Treatment Technical Field Representative for the Western Corn Belt, and Les Monroe, a soybean farmer from Northeast Missouri. And again, thanks to BASF and Farm Journal for their support in bringing this webinar to you. And thank you for joining us.